I still remember the text coming through on a chilly December morning like it was a punch to the gut. Don't come home for Christmas. Just like that. No explanation, no softening, just the cold words blinking on my phone screen. I stared at it for a moment, trying to process, before letting out a laugh that was part disbelief, part relief. Perfect, I typed back, even though they had no idea what I already knew, what they had no idea I had been hiding for months. That Christmas was going to be unlike any other, and not for the reasons they expected. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Hannah Carlisle, and I had spent most of my life trying to please my parents, only to find myself constantly running on a treadmill of their expectations, never quite measuring up. Growing up in a small suburban town outside Cleveland, Ohio, my parents, Linda and Roger Carlisle, had always projected the image of the perfect American family. Well-kept home, spotless lawns, holiday traditions that seemed like they were lifted straight from a magazine. Yet, behind closed doors, it was always about control, about keeping up appearances, and about reminding me that nothing I ever did would be enough. By the time I turned 28, I had learned the hard way that my dreams, my choices, even my friendships were secondary to their sense of pride. And that year, after a particularly brutal Thanksgiving argument over my decision to move cross-country for a new job, the tension between us reached a boiling point. The text that morning wasn't entirely surprising. In fact, in a way, it felt inevitable. My parents had never fully forgiven me for leaving Cleveland. The moment I had signed the papers for my apartment in Portland, Oregon, it was as if a fissure had opened, one that no holiday could mend. They didn't understand that I was chasing a life of my own, one where I wasn't constantly scrutinized for the clothes I wore, the friends I kept, or the career path I chose. But there it was, in stark black text on a white screen. Don't come home for Christmas. And unlike the dozens of passive-aggressive comments and guilt-laden speeches that had built up over the years, this was direct, final, uncompromising. I sat on my small apartment couch, letting the words sink in, while the soft glow of Christmas lights twinkled around the living room, a decoration I had put up the night before to remind myself that the holiday spirit wasn't entirely lost, even if my family seemed to have abandoned it. My cat, Milo, curled up beside me, sensing the unusual tension in the air, his tiny body vibrating with purrs as if trying to soothe me. I thought about the flights back to Cleveland I had already considered booking, the anxiety building at the idea of facing my mother's judgment, my father's cold stares, the endless questions about when I would settle down and start a real life. And suddenly, the text felt like liberation, not rejection. A boundary. A choice I hadn't realized I needed permission to make. But it wasn't just relief that coursed through me. It was also a strange mix of triumph and secrecy, because what my parents didn't know, what no one outside my closest circle knew, was that I had been secretly building a life that didn't include them. A life that finally felt mine. For months, I had been quietly saving, planning, and arranging. I had purchased a small fixer-upper in a quiet Portland neighborhood, a home that I had slowly transformed into a space that reflected me. Bright walls, plants in every corner, artwork that inspired me, and a tiny kitchen where I could experiment with recipes I had long dreamed of mastering. More than that, I had been preparing a surprise that would not only shock them, but also give me the validation I had sought my whole life. By the time Christmas arrived, I wasn't just avoiding their holiday drama. I was stepping into a life they hadn't imagined, one where I called the shots, and where my happiness didn't depend on their approval. Even as I felt that thrill of independence, a flicker of anxiety stirred in the back of my mind. I knew this move, this revelation, wouldn't come without friction. My parents were the kind who demanded control, who thrived on appearances, and who would never admit they were wrong. They might never forgive me, and I might face their disappointment head on. But for once, the stakes felt different. This wasn't about avoiding an argument or placating their fragile egos. This was about reclaiming a holiday, reclaiming a family narrative, and most importantly, reclaiming myself. I scrolled through the text conversation again, seeing their names at the top: Mom, Dad, and then a harsh black text that had ended so many unspoken debates over the years. And as I stared at it, I realized how far I had come. I wasn't the timid, people-pleasing daughter they had tried to mold. I wasn't the quiet girl who would quietly slip back into the holiday routine just to avoid conflict. That old version of me was gone. I had spent years preparing for this moment without even knowing it. The moment I could finally smile at their rejection, reply, "Perfect," and mean it. Not as a lie, not as a shield, but as a statement of my own truth.
So, with Milo nestled on my lap and the soft hum of my apartment's heater keeping the December chill at bay, I sent the reply. Just one word. Perfect. And in that moment, I felt the weight of years of restraint and fear lifting off my shoulders. The text was more than a response. It was a declaration. It was my first step into a Christmas that I could truly own. And little did they know, this year, the holiday wasn't about their expectations. It was about my revelation, my hidden plan, and the moment I would finally step out from under the shadow of their control. The story that had been quietly brewing for months was about to unfold, and there was no turning back now. The week leading up to Christmas had a peculiar tension in the air, one that felt both liberating and surreal. I spent my mornings walking through the quiet streets of Portland, the chill of winter biting at my cheeks but never dampening the excitement building inside me. Unlike previous years, there was no frantic packing, no mental checklist of what I needed to bring to appease my parents, no rehearsed pleasantries to smooth over old resentments. This year, I was in control. My apartment felt like a home than it ever had before, each corner reflecting choices I had made for myself, choices my parents had long dismissed as impractical or frivolous. The decorations I had put up weren't a nod to their expectations, but an expression of my own taste. Strings of warm white lights, framing the window, a modest but vibrant artificial tree in the corner, and homemade ornaments I had spent hours crafting. Even the smell of cinnamon and pine candles filled the space, wrapping the room in a comforting, festive warmth that had nothing to do with parental approval. Work had been a whirlwind that December, and while my colleagues were excited about their own holiday plans, I found myself quietly immersed in the details of my surprise. Over the past 6 months, I had quietly built a network of friends and mentors who had no connection to my parents and no interest in enforcing their control. My new life in Portland was full of people who appreciated me for me, and for the first time I realized how isolating my previous existence had been under the shadow of my family's expectations. I hadn't just moved for a job, I had moved for freedom, for the ability to create a life that aligned with my values and passions. It had taken months of careful planning to keep everything under wraps. Reserving venues, coordinating schedules, and secretly gathering mementos that would reveal a side of me my parents had never truly acknowledged. Even as I reveled in this newfound autonomy, there were moments when the old habits crept back in. When I saw a photo of my childhood home or a Facebook post about holiday gatherings, I felt the familiar pang of guilt that came with disappointing my parents. But this time, the guilt was tempered by a sense of clarity. I understood that my parents' rigid expectations had shaped me in ways both limiting and defining. And while I could honor the lessons I had learned from them, I didn't have to live within the confines they imposed. This was my story to write, and for the first time, I felt the exhilarating, terrifying truth of holding the pen in my own hand. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Throughout the week, I kept up the illusion of compliance. I sent texts that sounded polite but non-committal, replied to voicemails with vague promises to catch up soon, and even posted pictures on social media that suggested I was preparing for a solo holiday rather than the elaborate surprise I had planned. My parents predictably seemed oblivious to the subtext, their minds clearly focused on their own expectations of a traditional family Christmas. That oblivion became my advantage, a shield that allowed me to continue orchestrating my plan without interference. Each day, as I reviewed my checklist, I felt a mix of excitement and disbelief. Could I really pull this off? Could I finally step into a holiday defined by my own choices rather than their judgment? Friends had started noticing my energy, the way I moved through the week with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Emma, my closest friend from work, was the first to comment. "You look different," she said over coffee one morning. "Not just happier, like you've been waiting for this, like you finally get to do your own thing without worrying about anyone else." I smiled, careful not to give too much away. She didn't need to know the full extent of my plan, just that I was embracing this Christmas in a way that felt authentic. Even Marcus, my neighbor and occasional collaborator on creative projects, noticed the change. "You've got that sparkle in your eye," he said with a grin, "like you're about to do something big." And in a sense, I was. By midweek, the preparations were nearly complete. Packages I had ordered months ago arrived, hidden neatly in a storage closet I had rented under a false name, a precaution to ensure that nothing accidentally tipped off my parents. Invitations had been discreetly sent to a select group of friends who had become my surrogate family, people who would share in the joy without the drama. I even arranged for a small photographer to capture the moments, turning what could have been a quiet, self-contained victory into a celebration that would leave a lasting impression. Every detail mattered, from the holiday music playlist that reflected my taste to the candles that gave the apartment a warm, cozy glow. I wanted this Christmas to be an experience of revelation, a moment where the years of restraint and judgment melted away and left only truth. Yet amidst all the planning, a quiet anxiety lingered. I knew my parents' reaction could range from disbelief to outright anger. They had always struggled with control and disappointment, and a revelation like this, one that clearly demonstrated my independence and the life I had built without them, was bound to shake their expectations. But I told myself that their reaction, whatever it might be, was secondary. This Christmas wasn't about approval, it was about freedom, recognition, and finally stepping fully into the person I had spent years trying to become. As the days ticked down, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and nervous energy, the kind that comes before a turning point, a moment when the familiar world shifts into something new and irreversibly transformative. So I carried on with my week, executing every detail meticulously, savoring the sense of control I had never known in my family dynamic. With each passing day, the excitement built, intertwining with a quiet, underlying tension, the kind of tension that precedes a revelation that cannot be ignored. By the time the eve of Christmas arrived, the stage was set. My apartment was ready, my friends were informed, and the hidden truth I had been nurturing for months was poised to emerge. And through it all, my parents remained unaware, blissfully assuming that their daughter would either obey their expectations or crumble under them. Little did they know, the tables were about to turn. Christmas Eve arrived with a quiet intensity that seemed to hum through my Portland apartment like electricity. The city streets outside glowed with twinkling lights, carolers wandered from shop to shop, and the scent of roasted chestnuts and fresh pine wafted through the chilly air. Inside, I moved methodically, checking final details and making sure every corner reflected the vision I had been nurturing for months. But even amidst the excitement, an uneasy flutter lingered in my chest. It wasn't fear exactly, but an acute awareness that everything was about to change, that my parents, oblivious though they were, would soon find themselves confronted with a reality they had never imagined.
The inciting incident came unexpectedly in the form of a video call from my younger cousin Luke, whom I had always been close to. He had apparently been left out of my parents' early holiday updates and reached out to see if I would be joining any family Zoom calls. His cheerful face appeared on my laptop screen, framed by the warm glow of a Christmas tree in his living room. "Hey, Hannah, Mom and Dad wanted to ask, you're not coming home, right?" he asked, an awkward pause following. There was a casualness in his tone, but beneath it, I sensed a trace of tension, the kind that comes when someone is trying not to overstep, but also doesn't want to lie. The simple question, delivered in such an innocent way, felt like the spark that would ignite the moment of no return. I had anticipated this moment, of course. I had rehearsed it in my mind countless times, but the reality of it struck me differently. I smiled, leaning back in my chair and letting the warm light from my tree wash over me. "Nope," I said calmly, letting the word linger. "I'm staying here this year." There was a brief silence on the other side, and then Luke's expression shifted into a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Really? But what about your parents? Aren't they, you know..." He hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "Upset?" he finally finished. I laughed softly, shaking my head, though my eyes glimmered with a quiet triumph. "They already are. In fact, they texted me this morning and said, 'Don't come home for Christmas.' Perfect, right?" The words felt good on my tongue, carrying with them months of suppressed frustration, of quietly planned rebellion. Luke's eyebrows shot up. "Wait, perfect?" he echoed, clearly caught off guard. I nodded. "Perfect, because they don't know the rest. They don't know that this year isn't just about not going home. This year, it's about showing them exactly who I've become. And trust me, it's going to shock them." Luke blinked, a mix of confusion and intrigue crossing his face. Okay, you've definitely got my attention. But Hannah, what are you planning?" I grinned, choosing my words carefully, teasing the suspense without revealing anything. "All in time, Luke. Just, enjoy the show from where you are." I could hear his muffled laughter through the connection, and for a moment, the tension lifted, replaced by a sense of solidarity and excitement. Even on the other side of the screen, someone understood that this wasn't just about a holiday, it was about reclaiming control, stepping out from the shadows, and creating a narrative that had always been denied. After the call, I turned my attention back to my apartment, the space that had become my sanctuary. The lights on my tree shimmered, casting reflections across the walls adorned with photos, artwork, and memories I had carefully curated over the past year. Every detail was a statement, a quiet rebellion against the narrative my parents had tried to impose on me. The kitchen, filled with homemade cookies and a gingerbread house I had meticulously assembled, wasn't just decoration. It was a manifestation of the life I had built on my own terms. And the most important element of all, the surprise I had been orchestrating, was ready to unfold. That night, as I set the table for a small gathering with friends who had become my chosen family, the reality of the inciting incident settled over me like a warm, tingling weight. The text from my parents, Luke's call, the careful orchestration of months of secrecy, they all converged into a single, undeniable moment. The old way of living under their control was over. The breaking point had arrived. And while there was an undercurrent of anxiety, because I knew the revelation would not be smooth, because I knew emotions would flare and old wounds might reopen, there was also a profound sense of liberation. For the first time in years, I was moving forward not as the daughter they wanted me to be, but as the woman I had become in secret. As my friends arrived, the apartment buzzed with quiet excitement. Emma, holding a plate of homemade truffles, hugged me tightly. "You look radiant, Hannah. Something feels different this year," she whispered, eyes sparkling. Marcus, lugging a small speaker for music, grinned and said, "I feel like I'm witnessing history here. This Christmas is going to be legendary." Their enthusiasm bolstered my own, reinforcing the truth that I had made the right decision. I wasn't alone. I had built a support system that celebrated me, validated me, and gave me the courage to stand firmly in my own life. Later that evening, as we gathered around the tree sharing stories and laughter, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had led me here. The tension with my parents, the endless struggle to meet expectations, the quiet plotting of a secret life, all of it had built towards this moment. The breaking point, the inciting incident, wasn't just a text message or a phone call. It was the culmination of years of understanding, preparation, and quiet defiance. And in the warm glow of my apartment, surrounded by the people who had become my family by choice rather than obligation, I realized something profound. This Christmas, for the first time, was entirely mine. And that was when I truly understood the weight of what had just happened. The old rules no longer applied. The dynamics I had been trapped in for decades were shifting, and the story that my parents thought they controlled was about to take a direction only I could define. The breaking point wasn't a moment of despair or loss. It was the first spark of revelation, the first sign that the hidden truth I had been nurturing was ready to emerge, and the life I had been secretly building was about to come fully into view. The morning after Luke's call, the first ripple of my plan brushing against reality began to take shape. As sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting golden lines across my apartment floor, I sipped a cup of coffee and scrolled through my phone, already bracing myself for the inevitable questions from my parents. But what happened next was unexpected. My mother, Linda, had sent another text, not angry this time, not pleading, but curious, probing, almost tentative. "Hannah, are you sure about staying? Is everything okay? We want to understand." My heart skipped a beat. This was the first real sign that the outside eyes, the ones who had long been blind to my inner life, were beginning to notice cracks in the narrative they thought they controlled. For months, I had kept the details of my new life hidden, knowing that exposure would be complicated. But now, the first evidence of awareness had arrived, and it was intoxicating. I set my coffee down and considered my response carefully. I couldn't let them see the full picture, not yet. The surprise, the revelation I had nurtured, depended on timing. But at the same time, I realized that their curiosity was a signal. The facade of control they had relied on for years was starting to falter. With a calm smile, I typed back, "Everything's fine. Just taking this Christmas to recharge and enjoy some quiet time." It was the perfect balance of truth and concealment. A tiny hint of independence, but nothing that gave away my carefully orchestrated plan. Within minutes, Linda responded, "All right, we just want you to be happy. Hope you're safe and warm. Love you." A brief pang of wistfulness crossed my chest. Despite everything, a part of me still longed for their acknowledgement. But not on their terms, not at the cost of my autonomy.
Later that afternoon, I went out to pick up a few final touches for the surprise. As I walked through the bustling streets of Portland, I noticed the way people's eyes lingered on the decorations, how strangers smiled at the faint scent of pine and cinnamon in the air, how the city itself seemed to pulse with anticipation. I thought about my parents, about the control they had tried to exert over every aspect of my life, and how each of those efforts had inadvertently prepared me for this very moment. All those years of careful observation, subtle rebellion, and quiet endurance had culminated in a moment where the truth would finally be visible, undeniable, and transformative. When I returned, I found my apartment buzzing with quiet energy. My friends had arrived earlier to help with final setup, moving furniture, arranging gifts, and testing the lighting. Emma and Marcus exchanged glances that conveyed the same shared understanding we all felt. Something big was about to happen. We had rehearsed everything meticulously, from the placement of gifts to the timing of messages to my parents. The logistics were crucial. Any misstep could tip them off, ruin the moment, or worse, make it seem trivial. The pressure was real, but it was the kind of pressure that excites rather than crushes, the kind that turns anticipation into art.
By late afternoon, the first hint of exposure occurred. Marcus, while adjusting the angle of the camera for the live video call, accidentally sent a quick group snapshot to my parents' email. Me standing by the tree, surrounded by friends who had become my family, all of us laughing and holding props meant for the surprise. My heart jumped into my throat. This was it, the first undeniable proof that my parents weren't in control, that the narrative they had built for me was starting to unravel. I quickly called Marcus over, whispering a mix of laughter and urgency. That wasn't meant to go to them yet. He shrugged apologetically, grinning at the chaos, and I knew this slip was perfect in its imperfection. Within minutes, my phone buzzed incessantly. Multiple texts from both my mother and father appeared, all variations of shock, confusion, and tentative inquiry. Hannah, what is this? Who are these people? This doesn't look like Christmas at home. The flood of messages was exhilarating. For the first time, my parents were confronting evidence that I had created a life outside their influence. They were seeing proof, albeit incomplete, that their hold over me had weakened. I didn't respond immediately. Part of me wanted to let the suspense build, to savor the moment when the full revelation would hit them. Their confusion and the sudden cracks in their assumptions were the first signs that the old way of controlling me was faltering. As evening approached, I began final preparations for the central reveal. I had spent months arranging small details that would collectively serve as undeniable evidence of my independence. A photo montage of my new home, messages from friends expressing gratitude and connection, and a few tangible mementos symbolizing accomplishments they had never witnessed. These items, once displayed, would create a narrative that couldn't be ignored. By the time my parents saw it, there would be no room for denial, no way to reassert control, no space to rewrite the story in their favor. Their assumptions about obedience, tradition, and expectation were about to collide with the undeniable reality of my life. The first signs of external scrutiny, the first glimpse of truth through the cracks, were intoxicating and nerve-wracking in equal measure. I realized that the old dynamics were breaking down not through confrontation, but through exposure, through subtle evidence that the life they thought they dictated had always been evolving beyond their awareness. The outside eyes, my cousin, my friends, the accidental email, were now witnesses to the beginnings of a narrative shift. The delicate balance between concealment and revelation was in motion, and I could feel the momentum building. Sitting by the tree that evening, the soft glow of lights casting long shadows across the room, I allowed myself a moment of quiet reflection. For the first time, I was not defined by their expectations, not bound by the rules they had enforced for decades. The first plot point had arrived. Outside eyes were now seeing the truth. The carefully maintained cover-up of my life, my plans, my independence, was beginning to crumble. And with it came a sense of liberation I had never known. The breaking point had given way to exposure, and exposure was the first step towards transformation. And as I looked at the gleaming ornaments, the gifts stacked neatly beneath the tree, and the faces of my friends who had become my chosen family, I understood something profoundly simple yet radical. The narrative was mine now, and no one, not even my parents, could take that away. By the morning of Christmas Eve, the calm of the previous day had given way to an undercurrent of tension that was impossible to ignore. My phone buzzed incessantly with messages from my parents, each one carrying a different shade of disbelief, confusion, and subtle accusation. "Hannah, this is not what we expected," Roger had texted first, followed by Linda's equally fraught, "We don't understand why you're doing this." The barrage of messages could have been overwhelming, but I had prepared myself for this exact moment. The first pinch point had arrived, and with it, the rising opposition, the subtle but relentless pressure from the people who had always assumed control over my life. This was the point where the truth I had been nurturing began to collide with the resistance I had anticipated for years.
I read their texts carefully, letting each one sink in. They were trying to regain control, to make sense of the evidence they were now seeing. And in their attempts, they were exposing the very dynamics I had spent months navigating. The mix of confusion, judgment, and veiled threats in their words was familiar, a replay of past arguments where they attempted to manipulate outcomes and enforce obedience. But this time, the stakes were different. I wasn't just responding to accusations or placating their anxieties. I was orchestrating a revelation, guiding the narrative on my own terms. Their opposition, no matter how forceful, could not derail what I had built in secret. The morning passed with the steady hum of activity in my apartment. Emma and Marcus arrived early to help finalize the decorations and prepare for the evening gathering, moving furniture, adjusting lighting, and arranging the gifts in precise order. I explained that I had received more texts from my parents, and they exchanged knowing glances. "Sounds like the cavalry is getting anxious," Marcus said, half joking, but I could see the truth in his eyes. They understood that this was more than just a casual holiday plan. This was a calculated exposure, a confrontation with years of unspoken control. Emma nodded, smiling but serious. "Let them come with their confusion and their judgment. It won't matter once the full picture emerges." As the day progressed, I noticed the mounting pressure in subtle ways beyond the texts. A neighbor who had noticed unusual activity at my apartment began making small inquiries, and social media notifications indicated that my parents had reached out to a few distant relatives, trying to gauge what was happening. It was as if the world around me was becoming attuned to the truth before they were ready to accept it. This rising opposition, the outside scrutiny mingled with my parents' escalating attempts to regain control, was precisely what would make the eventual reveal so powerful. I realized that the tension itself was a necessary ingredient, heightening the stakes and sharpening the emotional impact of what was to come. By mid-afternoon, I was managing multiple fronts at once. I had to respond to innocuous questions without revealing the surprise, monitor the preparations for the evening gathering, and maintain my composure despite the mounting pressure. It was exhausting, but also exhilarating in a way that felt entirely new. For the first time, I was fully in control of the narrative, directing the timing, the details, and the unfolding drama. And yet, the opposition was relentless. My parents' texts had become more insistent, their tone shifting from tentative curiosity to subtle insistence, attempting to guilt or confuse me. "Hannah, we just don't understand. Why would you exclude us from this tradition? Are you sure you're thinking this through?" another message read. Their words, meant to intimidate, only reinforced the importance of my plan. I knew that resistance was a natural response to a disruption of control, and I welcomed it as confirmation that I was pushing against boundaries that had long constrained me. The preparation continued in a rhythm that blended urgency and excitement. I set the table with care, ensuring that every detail, the placement of plates, the arrangement of candles, the positioning of gifts, was perfect. The food was prepared in advance, carefully portioned and styled to create a sense of warmth and celebration. My friends moved about efficiently, following my guidance, but also contributing their own touches that enhanced the atmosphere. The apartment, once a quiet sanctuary, now hummed with activity, anticipation, and a collective purpose. It was no longer just my private rebellion. It had become a shared experience, a collaborative creation designed to confront the hidden dynamics with undeniable evidence. As evening approached, the tension reached its peak. My parents' messages escalated in urgency, and I could feel the weight of their rising opposition pressing against the calm I had cultivated. I took a moment to sit by the tree, Milo curled up next to me, and breathed deeply. I reminded myself that this opposition was temporary, that it was an inevitable step in the process, and that it would only serve to make the eventual revelation more impactful. I had anticipated resistance, prepared for it, and was determined to let it build the suspense without allowing it to undermine my control. Their disbelief, confusion, and subtle attempts at intimidation were simply the prelude to the moment when the truth would be undeniable and undeniable in its power. By the time my friends and I were ready to begin the evening's gathering, the rising opposition had created a palpable sense of anticipation. The apartment, glowing with lights and filled with the aroma of baked goods, was ready to become the stage for the confrontation of control versus truth. My parents' texts, my neighbor's curiosity, and the subtle stirrings of social media attention had all combined to set the scene.
The rising pressure, the first pinch point in our story, had transformed the ordinary act of Christmas preparation into a charged, high-stakes environment. It was clear that the opposition would not relent, that my parents' attempts to manipulate or control me would continue. But the stage was now set for the pivotal moments ahead, where the culmination of months of preparation would finally collide with their expectations.
Sitting back, observing the scene around me, I felt a rush of clarity. This was exactly where I needed to be, in control, surrounded by allies, with rising opposition that would make the eventual revelation undeniable. The first pinch point was complete. The tension had escalated, the stakes were higher than ever, and the path toward the major revelation was clear. All that remained was to step into the next phase of the plan, where evidence would become undeniable, and the truth I had been nurturing would finally demand acknowledgement from those who had long sought to suppress it. The moment of undeniable proof arrived just as the evening shadows stretched across my apartment, painting everything in hues of gold and amber. I had spent weeks orchestrating this particular scene, ensuring every element, the timing, the guests, the visuals, would collide in a way that left no room for doubt. The apartment was now a warm, festive sanctuary, filled with the laughter and chatter of friends who had become my chosen family. The tree glittered with ornaments, each representing a memory, a milestone, or a personal triumph that my parents had never acknowledged. The gifts were carefully curated, and the small video screen in the corner silently looping a montage of my achievements, my new life, and the moments I had cultivated in secret glimmered with evidence of my independence. Every detail was a visual confirmation of a reality my parents could no longer ignore. It began with a single innocuous message I sent to them, an invitation to join a live video feed of the evening. I framed it casually, careful not to hint at the magnitude of what they were about to witness. "Hey, if you want to see what we're up to tonight, click here," I typed, pressing send with a calm certainty. Within moments, their responses arrived, hesitant, curious, and unmistakably uneasy. Roger's text read simply, "What is this? Who's all there?" And Linda's followed, tinged with a mixture of worry and exasperation. "Hannah, we don't understand. Please explain what's happening." I smiled, knowing that this was precisely the moment I had been waiting for. The first glimpse they had of my life outside their control had been mere hints. Now the evidence would be undeniable. I pressed the start button on the video call, and their faces appeared in tiny boxes on the screen, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and tentative curiosity. I guided them through the apartment visually, panning the camera across the room to reveal the full setup: the decorated tree, the personalized gifts, the festive table laden with food, and the joyful faces of my friends. I let the camera linger on a wall adorned with framed photos of moments they had never seen, my art exhibitions, volunteer work, and snapshots from trips I had taken without their approval. The evidence was irrefutable, concrete proof that I had built a life entirely on my own terms. Their reactions were immediate and visceral. Linda's mouth fell open, eyes scanning the scene with a mix of shock and dawning comprehension. Roger leaned forward, brow furrowed, clearly struggling to process the magnitude of what they were seeing. Text messages began pouring in over the video feed. "Hannah, is this real? Who's all there? How did you—" Each question, each exclamation was a confirmation that the truth I had nurtured in secrecy had finally pierced their assumptions. They could no longer claim ignorance, no longer deny my autonomy, no longer frame my choices as mere rebellion or foolishness. The proof was there, visible and undeniable, and it left them without recourse. For the first time, I allowed myself to savor the moment, feeling a deep, satisfying surge of empowerment. Months of careful planning, quiet observation, and strategic concealment had culminated in this single transformative event. The truth was no longer hidden.
The life I had built, the choices I had made, the independence I had claimed was now fully exposed, and the old dynamics, the controlling narratives my parents had attempted to impose, were crumbling before my eyes. The power of the moment was almost overwhelming, a heady mix of triumph, relief, and quiet vindication. Yet the revelation was more than just visual evidence. It was emotional, psychological, and symbolic. Every laugh, every conversation, every small act of joy broadcast on the screen was a demonstration that my life was no longer defined by their expectations. The room filled with my friends' chatter, their teasing, their warmth. It all stood as living proof that I had cultivated connection, happiness, and fulfillment outside of their oversight. This was not just independence, it was flourishing, undeniable, and complete, and it challenged every assumption they had held about control, obedience, and what Christmas should look like. I could see the tension in their faces, the subtle adjustments as they tried to process the scale of what was unfolding. There was no anger yet, only stunned comprehension, which was far more potent. They were confronting undeniable proof of something they had long dismissed, that I was capable of creating my own life, that I could build joy without their approval, and that their attempts to govern my choices had been rendered irrelevant by the reality of my achievements. This was the midpoint, the major revelation, the turning point where the old narrative could no longer survive in the light of incontrovertible evidence.
As the video feed continued, I guided them through each corner of the apartment, explaining in gentle, measured tones what each detail represented. A framed painting on the wall was my first solo art show, something they had never attended or acknowledged. A small stack of certificates reflected volunteer work and community involvement they had ignored. Every object, every image, every carefully orchestrated moment was evidence that could not be denied or disputed. My parents' silence, punctuated only by intermittent questions and exclamations, confirmed that the proof was absolute. There was no retreat, no rationalization that could undo what they were seeing. By the time I ended the tour, I felt a deep, satisfying sense of completion. The major revelation was no longer impending. It had arrived. The culmination of months of planning, quiet resilience, and strategic concealment had manifested in a moment of undeniable clarity. My parents were witnessing the truth, and that truth was not just a declaration, it was a transformation. A turning point where the trajectory of our relationships would be irrevocably altered. For the first time in years, I had seized the narrative entirely, and the power of that reality settled over me with a quiet, profound intensity. Sitting back, Milo curled in my lap, I let the warmth of the room, the laughter of my friends, and the soft glow of the lights wash over me. The midpoint had arrived, the major revelation had been made, and everything had changed. There was no going back to the old dynamic, no retreat into the shadows of expectation, no room for denial. The truth was out, undeniable, and it was mine. The aftermath of the revelation was nothing short of electric. My parents, still on the video call, sat in stunned silence, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, shock, and to some degree, hurt. The room was heavy with the weight of unspoken words as I observed their reactions, realizing that the next step was critical. The major revelation had shattered the old illusions, but now the responsibility to speak my truth fully rested on my shoulders. I knew that if I remained silent, the opportunity for transformation, the chance to reset the narrative entirely, would slip through my fingers. I took a deep breath, feeling the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat, and acknowledged that this was the second plot point, the moment of no return. I would no longer protect their feelings at the cost of my own voice. I would speak everything I had held inside for years, and the consequences would be theirs to face. It began cautiously, almost tentatively. "Mom, Dad," I said, my voice calm but resolute, "I need you to understand something.
This isn't just about staying home for Christmas. It's about everything that has been left unsaid. All the years of judgment, control, and expectation that I've tried to navigate quietly. I'm not angry with you. I'm done trying to be who you wanted me to be. I'm finally being who I am. The words felt foreign and liberating as they left my lips. My parents' expressions shifted almost imperceptibly, a mixture of confusion and defensive bracing, as if they were preparing for confrontation. But I pressed on, knowing that hesitation would only dilute the impact. I recounted memories long buried under the weight of expectation. The holidays when my achievements were minimized, the subtle criticisms that left me questioning my worth, the endless lectures about how I should live, what I should prioritize, and how I should define success. I spoke of the nights I had spent feeling invisible in my own family, the small victories I celebrated in secret, and the silent triumph of building a life outside their approval. Each word was deliberate, measured, a careful unfolding of the truth that could no longer remain hidden. I saw my mother's eyes welling with tears, not of anger but of disbelief, as she attempted to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with the woman who was now asserting her autonomy so clearly. My father, Roger, shifted uncomfortably, crossing his arms and pacing slightly in his chair as if to create physical space between himself and the revelation. "Hannah, we didn't realize," he began, his voice faltering. "We thought we were supporting you. We never meant to—" I stopped him gently. "You never realized, Dad. That's the point. I've lived in your shadow for years, trying to please you, trying to meet your expectations, and every time I did, it was never enough. I didn't rebel or refuse lightly. I chose to build something different, something that reflects who I truly am." The words rang in the small apartment, amplified by the quiet attention of my friends who watched in supportive silence. There was a tense pause, the kind of pregnant silence that comes when old dynamics finally fracture and the truth hangs in the air, undeniable. I could feel my own strength solidifying in that pause, a sense of certainty that had eluded me for years. This was no longer about secrecy or rebellion. It was about reclamation. By speaking openly, I was claiming not only my independence, but also the narrative of my life, refusing to let the shadow of judgment dictate the story any longer. The words had weight, power, and permanence, and I knew that once they were spoken, there could be no retreat.
Mom, Dad, I continued, my tone steady but firm. I know this isn't easy for you. I know it challenges the way you've always understood our family, but it's my reality. I've built friendships, a home, and a life that bring me joy. Things you haven't acknowledged, things you never will if I keep hiding who I am. This Christmas isn't just about being away from home. It's about showing you that your influence, while important in my past, does not define my future. The honesty in my words seemed to settle over them slowly, like a weight that had been lifted yet demanded acknowledgement. Their eyes met mine, and for the first time, I sensed a tentative recognition. Not full acceptance, but awareness that the old story was irreversibly changing. I watched as they absorbed the scope of my message. Linda wiped a tear from her cheek, her lips pressed tightly together as she processed what I was saying. Roger's posture softened slightly, his defensive stance giving way to something closer to comprehension. I felt a mixture of relief and intensity. Relief that my voice had been heard, intensity because I knew this was only the beginning of the reckoning. The second plot point had arrived. I had stepped into the full light of truth, and there was no turning back. I had chosen to speak, to break free from decades of control, and to demand acknowledgement of the person I had become. As the conversation continued, my friends offered support through quiet smiles and nods, never interrupting but providing a safety net that reminded me I was not alone in this confrontation. The living room, filled with festive lights and the soft hum of music, now felt like a battleground where truth confronted expectation. And in that space, I realized something profoundly liberating. The choice to speak was not just an act of defiance. It was a moment of reclamation, an affirmation of identity, and a declaration that I would no longer allow old patterns to dictate my life.
By the time the conversation concluded, the tension remained, but it had shifted. It was no longer a force seeking to control me. It was a recognition of the boundaries I had established, a dawning understanding that the rules had changed. The second plot point was complete. I had made the choice to speak fully, to reveal my truth without compromise, and in doing so, I had crossed a line that ensured my autonomy could never again be dismissed or undermined. The moment of no return had passed, and I was ready for the confrontation that would test the strength of both my resolve and my parents' willingness to accept reality. The confrontation with my parents escalated faster than I had anticipated. Even after I had spoken my truth fully, the tension in the air was palpable, like static electricity before a storm. Their initial shock had evolved into subtle but relentless pressure, a combination of disbelief, guilt, and thinly veiled threats. "Hannah," Roger said sharply over the video call, his voice tinged with frustration, "you're making a mistake. You're isolating yourself, and it's not healthy. We raised you to be responsible, to honor family." The words hit like an echo from the past, familiar, and yet now powerless against the force of the life I had created. I could see Linda's concern mirrored in his tone, her eyes searching mine as if trying to negotiate a compromise that simply didn't exist. The confrontation had arrived, and the stakes were higher than ever. I took a steadying breath, letting the quiet hum of the apartment around me anchor me in the present. My friends, sensing the tension, lingered in the background, ready to support but leaving space for me to navigate this delicate interaction. "I understand your concern," I replied calmly, choosing my words with precision. "But this isn't isolation, it's empowerment. I've built a life full of support, community, and fulfillment. You're seeing only a glimpse, but every detail you're questioning is a testament to the independence you've never acknowledged. The rules you think apply don't anymore." My tone was firm, unwavering, a clear signal that the confrontation was not going to bend me back into the expectations of the past. What followed was a barrage of subtle manipulation attempts, the kind that had defined our relationship for years. My parents questioned everything: the people I had invited, the choices I had made, the paths I had pursued. "Who are all these people?" Linda asked vaguely at the screen where friends laughed and interacted around me. "Are they really your friends, or are they a distraction from what matters?" Roger chimed in, his voice growing more insistent. "You're smart, Hannah. You know better than to let yourself get carried away. Don't let this be a rebellion that backfires." Their attempts to intimidate or destabilize me, to make me second-guess the life I had deliberately constructed, were almost automatic, yet I could now see through them with clarity I hadn't possessed before.
I didn't flinch. I had anticipated this escalation, and every ounce of training, preparation, and quiet endurance that had led me here kicked in. "These are my friends," I said firmly, allowing the camera to pan subtly across the room so they could see the faces of those who would become my chosen family. "This is my life. Every person here, every choice I've made, every step I've taken is deliberate and meaningful. I am not acting out of rebellion. I am living authentically, and it's time you saw that clearly, without trying to twist it into something it's not." I could see the resistance in their faces, the way their brows furrowed, their lips pressed tightly, the almost imperceptible shift as they tried to regain control. But there was no leverage left. The confrontation had reached its peak, and the evidence was undeniable. The conversation grew more heated as they tried new tactics. Roger attempted to invoke guilt. "Hannah, don't you think about how this affects the rest of the family, about how your choices make things harder for us?" And Linda, with tears welling in her eyes, layered concern over accusation. "We only want to see you happy, but this feels like you're shutting us out." I listened, acknowledged, and then countered with clarity. "I know you want that," I said, my voice steady, "but your definition of happiness is not mine. Shutting you out? No. I'm including you in my life in the way that works for me. I'm showing you the truth as it is, not as you want it to be. I am not rejecting you. I am reclaiming myself." The weight of those words settled heavily, and I could sense that the mounting pressure, the second pinch point of direct confrontation, was forcing them to confront reality they had long ignored. Every question, every attempt to intimidate or manipulate only reinforced the undeniable reality.
I had grown beyond their control. Their mounting pressure was a mirror of the resistance I had overcome internally over the past months. And while there was still tension, thinly veiled attempts to sway or destabilize me, I could feel the shift. The confrontation, intense and emotionally charged, was not breaking me. It was crystallizing the independence I had fought for. I was finally standing unshakable in my own life, and the mounting pressure was revealing the full extent of the old dynamics crumbling under truth and evidence. By the end of the video call, the confrontation had subsided into a tense, reflective silence. My parents' expressions softened slightly, though the discomfort lingered, a reminder that change is never instantaneous. I allowed myself a moment of quiet triumph, knowing that I had faced the full force of opposition and emerged not just unscathed, but empowered. The second pinch point had served its purpose. The confrontation had revealed the antagonist's true nature, exposed the limits of their control, and set the stage for the consequences and challenges that would inevitably follow. I had faced the mounting pressure head-on, validated my independence, and reinforced the undeniable proof that the life I was living was fully my own. Sitting back, watching my friends continue to laugh and celebrate around me, I felt a deep sense of resolution forming, even amidst the lingering tension. The confrontation had tested me in every way, emotionally, psychologically, and strategically, but I had navigated it successfully. The second pinch point, the moment of mounting pressure and challenge, had reached its climax, leaving me poised for what would come next. The dark night of the soul, the lowest point where consequences and backlash would fully manifest. And yet, even in the shadow of that inevitability, I felt an unshakable clarity. The truth was out, my voice had been heard, and the transformation was underway. The hours following the confrontation were a strange mixture of relief and dread. My friends had gradually dispersed, leaving me in the quiet of my apartment, the lights from the Christmas tree casting soft, flickering shadows across the walls. For the first time, I was alone with the full weight of what I had set in motion. The exhilaration of the revelation and confrontation had been fading, replaced with an emptiness that felt heavier than I had anticipated. It was as if the momentum of the previous events had carried me forward, but now the reality of consequences, both emotional and relational, was settling in. I realized this was the dark night of the soul, the moment when the cost of speaking the truth became undeniably real, and the emotional toll reached its peak. Almost immediately, the messages began arriving again, this time less inquisitive, more pointed and edged with frustration. "Hannah, don't you recognize the person you've become?" Roger's text read, sharp and cold, as if trying to rewrite the narrative they could no longer control. "What happened to the daughter we raised?" Linda followed with a string of texts that combined sorrow and subtle reproach. "We only want to see you happy, but this feels like you're shutting us out." Each message struck me like a physical blow, the sting of parental disapproval cutting deeper than any argument or confrontation had before. The evidence was clear. They were struggling to reconcile my autonomy with their expectations, and the backlash was immediate and intense.
I sat on the edge of the sofa, Milo curled tightly at my feet, and tried to breathe through the storm of emotions. There was anger, yes, and frustration, but also an acute sadness. All my life, I had sought their acknowledgement, their approval, their love in ways that often required me to hide pieces of myself. Now, having finally revealed those pieces, I felt the weight of their disappointment pressing on me. It was a paradox. I had achieved the independence I longed for, yet the cost of that independence was the emotional estrangement that threatened to overwhelm me. The dark night of the soul was not just a concept, it was tangible, a suffocating presence that forced me to confront the full scope of the consequences I had initiated. Friends checked in throughout the night, their texts offering support and reassurance, but even their comforting words couldn't erase the sense of isolation that had descended. "You did the right thing," Emma's message read, simple but powerful. Marcus added, "Truth has weight, and it's heavy sometimes, but it also sets you free." Their words were anchors, reminders that the backlash I was experiencing was temporary, that it was a necessary stage in the process of transformation. Still, reading the messages, I felt the intensity of the low point acutely. It wasn't just my parents' anger or confusion. It was the realization that speaking truth comes with real costs, sometimes in the form of strained relationships, disappointment, and profound emotional labor. As the night deepened, I reflected on the accumulation of small moments that had led to this point. The years of quiet endurance, the subtle acts of rebellion, the careful cultivation of a separate life, the painstaking orchestration of the revelation. Each step had brought me closer to this moment, yet each step also magnified the stakes. I realized that the backlash was not a punishment, but a natural consequence of shifting power dynamics. The people who had once held control over me were now confronted with a reality they could neither manipulate nor deny. Their struggle to adjust, while painful, was an inevitable reaction to the transformation I had initiated. And yet, in the quiet solitude of the dark night of the soul, it was impossible not to feel the weight of that struggle personally. I found myself replaying their words, trying to understand the nuances behind each text, each expression, each hesitation in our video call. "We don't recognize you." That phrase kept returning, echoing in my mind. I understood what it meant. They were facing the undeniable truth that I had grown beyond the boundaries they had defined, that the daughter they had raised according to their expectations was no longer the person I had become. It was both validating and devastating. The validation came from the recognition of my autonomy. The devastation came from the recognition of the relational gap it had created. This was the emotional toll of independence, the confrontation with the fact that speaking truth often comes at the cost of temporary or sometimes permanent estrangement. Hours passed, and I allowed myself to simply sit with the discomfort, to feel the loneliness and uncertainty without trying to fix it. I thought about the choices that had led me here and the courage it had taken to cross the threshold of truth. I considered the possible outcomes: reconciliation, continued tension, or even prolonged distance. None of them were certain, and yet all of them were part of the path I had chosen. The dark night of the soul is defined by ambiguity, by the lack of immediate resolution. And in that ambiguity, I felt both vulnerability and power intertwined. I had revealed myself fully, and now I had to endure the aftermath. By the time dawn began to creep over the horizon, the weight had not entirely lifted, but it had shifted slightly. The intensity of the backlash, while still present, was less acute. I had survived the confrontation, faced the consequences, and remained grounded in my identity. The dark night of the soul was not a punishment, but a crucible, a moment of testing, endurance, and reflection that strengthened my resolve and prepared me for the next stage, the final push, where the truth would be presented fully to authority, community, and the world at large. I knew that what had felt like isolation in the dark hours of the night was actually preparation for the clarity and empowerment that lay ahead. The morning of the final push arrived with a quiet intensity that belied the storm of emotions I had endured the night before. I woke early, the soft light of dawn spilling through the curtains, and felt a calm determination settle over me. The dark night of the soul had passed, leaving a clarity I had never experienced before. I knew what needed to happen. The truth had to be presented fully, publicly, without ambiguity, without room for doubt. It wasn't enough that my parents had witnessed it in fragments, or that friends had observed the celebration. It was time for the culmination, the moment when all the pieces aligned, when the evidence, the planning, and my courage would converge in an undeniable final push.
I spent the morning organizing the living room once more, adjusting the decorations and placing a few symbolic items in precise locations. The small digital photo frame that had looped the montage of my independent life now displayed a curated sequence of accomplishments and joyful moments, each image a testament to choices made freely and deliberately. Gifts were positioned carefully, each representing milestones and relationships my parents had ignored or dismissed over the years. It was as though the apartment itself had become a stage, the backdrop for the climactic presentation of truth. Every detail mattered. Every placement reinforced the narrative I was about to unfold.
By mid-morning, guests began to arrive, aware that today was more than a simple holiday gathering. Emma, Marcus, and the others moved efficiently, helping me finalize the setup while sharing quiet words of encouragement. "This is it," Emma said softly, her eyes glinting with the same excitement I felt. "Every detail, every moment, it all comes together now." Marcus nodded, adding, "They won't be able to ignore it. It's all there, undeniable." The reassurance reminded me that the power of this moment extended beyond my own perception. It was validated by the tangible presence of allies who had witnessed the preparation, the careful orchestration, and the life I had built. The truth had grown beyond me. It had become a living, breathing force that demanded acknowledgement. I sent one final message to my parents, this time with a tone that was neither pleading nor defensive, simply factual and inviting. "Roger, Linda, if you want to see what this Christmas looks like, please join us. We're ready to show you everything." Within minutes, they were connected to the video feed, their faces appearing on the screen, framed by a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and residual tension from the previous days. I began the walkthrough with deliberate pacing, allowing the camera to linger on each area, each symbol, each detail of the environment I had curated. The montage of achievements, the laughter of friends, the warmth of the scene, it all coalesced into a visual and emotional narrative that left no room for denial. The reactions were immediate and profound. Linda's hands trembled slightly as she reached to adjust the camera, her eyes wide as she absorbed the full scope of what she was witnessing. Roger leaned forward, jaw tight, his posture rigid as though bracing for impact. Texts and whispered exclamations streamed across the feed. We didn't know. This is incredible. Hannah, we see it now." Their words, tentative and fragmented, were proof of the effectiveness of the final push. This was no longer a matter of debate or argument. It was a confrontation with the reality that had been meticulously prepared, and it could not be ignored or dismissed. I took a deep breath and began to narrate the significance of each element, guiding them through the milestones, the friends, the accomplishments, and the moments of personal triumph that defined my journey. "This is my life," I said calmly but firmly, "not as you imagined it, but as I have created it. Each step, each choice, each relationship has been deliberate. I've built joy, independence, and fulfillment outside the expectations that once constrained me. And today, you're witnessing it fully." The calm authority in my voice contrasted sharply with the tension on the other side of the screen, and I could see the resistance slowly giving way to comprehension. The emotional impact of the final push was magnified by the presence of my chosen family, the friends who had supported me and celebrated my autonomy. Their laughter, their genuine interactions, and their affirmations of my identity created an undeniable counterpoint to any lingering skepticism from my parents. Every smile, every spontaneous moment of joy, every word of support reinforced the narrative I was presenting. This was real, this was mine, and it could not be erased or dismissed. The combination of objective evidence, emotional resonance, and deliberate orchestration created a force that left my parents with no defenses. By the end of the walkthrough, the room is charged with a mixture of relief, validation, and transformation. My parents' faces softened, the rigid lines of doubt and resistance replaced with tentative acceptance. Roger's voice was quieter now, almost reverent. "Hannah, we didn't understand. We see now." Linda nodded slowly, tears spilling down her cheeks, her hand reaching toward the screen as though trying to bridge the emotional gap that had formed over the years. The final push had succeeded, not through argument, not through confrontation alone, but through the undeniable clarity of evidence, preparation, and authentic presentation. As I ended the video call, a deep sense of fulfillment washed over me. The truth had been presented fully, publicly, and without compromise. The culmination of months of careful planning, quiet resilience, and emotional courage had manifested in a moment of undeniable clarity. The final push was complete. The confrontation with expectation and denial had been met, the evidence was unassailable, and the transformation of our dynamic was underway. I could feel, for the first time in years, the tangible weight of liberation settling in, a quiet assurance that the journey I had undertaken, though challenging, painful, and demanding, had reached its climactic triumph. In the days following the climactic revelation, a subtle transformation began to settle over my life. The immediate tension and confrontation with my parents had passed, leaving in its wake a tentative new equilibrium. I could still sense the remnants of discomfort lingering in their interactions, a cautious recalibration of what our relationship could look like moving forward. Yet, at the same time, there was a remarkable shift. The walls of expectation that had loomed over me for years were no longer imposing or suffocating. They had been challenged, exposed, and, for the first time, replaced with the possibility for understanding, even if it was imperfect. The resolution was not instantaneous, but it was tangible, a quiet validation that the truth I had fought to assert was now acknowledged. I spent the following week navigating this delicate terrain with both patience and clarity. My parents reached out intermittently, their messages alternating between cautious inquiries and tentative congratulations. "We're proud of what you've accomplished," Linda wrote one evening, her words careful but genuine. Roger's message followed. "We don't always understand your choices, but we see the life you've built. That matters." These words, though restrained, carried enormous weight. They were not declarations of complete acceptance, but they were acknowledgement, the recognition that my independence and authenticity were real, valid, and worthy of respect. I allowed myself to feel the quiet relief and triumph that accompanied this shift, knowing that the resolution of our dynamic was unfolding gradually, deliberately, and on terms that reflected my autonomy. Part of the new equilibrium involved redefining our interactions. Conversations with my parents were no longer laced with implicit judgment or veiled criticism. Instead, they were tentative but open, exploratory and cautious, like two people learning a new language after years of misunderstanding. I could feel the tension soften as I shared my daily life with them, allowing glimpses of my world without the weight of obligation or expectation. My friends continued to serve as an anchor, a reminder that the support and affirmation I had cultivated outside my family were real, consistent, and sustaining. This broader sense of community reinforced the legitimacy of the life I had built, further solidifying the resolution and the gradual rebalancing of our relationships. The experience also reshaped my internal landscape. For the first time in years, I felt a profound sense of peace that was not contingent on their approval or validation. The act of speaking my truth, presenting evidence of my autonomy, and facing the consequences head on had released a burden I had carried quietly for so long. There was a subtle but unmistakable shift in my confidence, a deepened sense of agency, and an unshakable awareness of my own value. It was as if a fog had lifted, revealing a life in which I was no longer constrained by fear of disapproval, guilt, or obligation. The resolution was not just relational, it was deeply personal, a transformation that radiated outward into every interaction, every choice, every corner of my daily life. One evening, as I hosted a small dinner with friends who had supported me throughout this journey, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Hannah," it read simply, "thank you for showing us your world. We may not understand everything yet, but we want to be a part of it in the way that you want us to be." My heart swelled at the words. They reflected the essence of resolution, not perfection, not total alignment, but mutual acknowledgement and a willingness to respect boundaries while building connection. I realized then that this was what I had been striving for all along, not to force understanding or compliance, but to claim my life fully and invite my parents to witness it authentically, on terms that respected my identity and autonomy. The equilibrium also manifested in small but meaningful ways. Conversations shifted from old patterns of control and expectation to genuine curiosity and engagement. My parents began to ask about my projects, my friends, and my day-to-day experiences in a way that reflected interest rather than judgment. They inquired about my art, my volunteer work, and even the small joys I found in ordinary routines.
Each question, each moment of engagement was evidence of the new balance, a recognition that our relationships could evolve, that respect and acknowledgement could replace control, and authenticity could coexist with familial connection. In this period of resolution, I also found myself reflecting on the journey that had led here. The weeks of careful planning, the orchestration of undeniable evidence, the confrontation, and even the dark night of the soul had all served a purpose. Each stage had been necessary to dismantle old dynamics, challenge assumptions, and establish the conditions for authentic reconciliation. The process had been arduous, emotionally taxing, and at times isolating. Yet it had yielded a profound transformation. The resolution was not simply an external shift, it was a holistic, multi-layered change that encompassed both relationships and self-perception.
By the end of the week, a sense of stability began to settle over my life. I could interact with my parents without the shadow of fear or resentment, and I could celebrate my accomplishments without the lingering anxiety of judgment. The equilibrium was not perfect, but it was functional, healthy, and most importantly, sustainable. I had achieved a state in which truth, respect, and acknowledgement could coexist, where autonomy was honored and where connection was possible without compromise of identity. The resolution had been earned through courage, strategic thinking, and emotional resilience, and the result was deeply validating. Sitting quietly in the living room one evening, the soft glow of the Christmas lights reflecting off the ornaments, I allowed myself to fully absorb the sense of vindication and peace that had emerged. My friends were laughing in the kitchen, Milo slept at my feet, and my phone buzzed intermittently with messages from my parents, each one a gentle reminder that connection was possible without surrendering my independence. The resolution, though gradual and evolving, had transformed my life in profound ways. The truth I had fought to assert had prevailed, and in doing so, had created a foundation for a new, healthier, and more authentic set of relationships. The weeks that followed the resolution felt like a gentle unfolding, a transformation that had been set into motion and was now settling naturally into my daily life. The tension with my parents had not vanished entirely, but it had softened, reshaped into a cautious respect that acknowledged the boundaries I had established. I could feel the subtle shift in our interactions, the way conversations began with curiosity rather than judgment, the way their questions were genuine rather than evaluative. The final image of this journey, my transformation, was not a dramatic spectacle, but a quiet, enduring proof of resilience, courage, and the power of authenticity. Every choice I had made, every risk I had taken, had culminated in a life that was fully mine, and I felt a sense of peace I had never known before. That first morning after the holidays, I stood by the window in my apartment, a steaming cup of coffee warming my hands, and watched the snow fall lightly over the city. It had been a long road to get here, from the initial message telling me not to come home for Christmas, through the confrontation, the backlash, and the final push. I thought about the fear I had felt, the anxiety that had gripped me during the dark night of the soul, and the relief that had followed the resolution. Standing there, watching the snow settle softly on the streets, I realized that the transformation was not just relational, it was deeply personal. I had emerged from the storm stronger, more confident, and unshakably aware of my own worth. In the quiet of that morning, I reflected on the ways my life had shifted. For the first time, I could pursue my passions without guilt, make choices without hesitation, and build relationships that were authentic and reciprocal. My friends, who had been steadfast throughout the journey, became even more integral to my sense of belonging and validation. They were no longer just support during crisis. They were living proof of the life I had chosen, a life defined by mutual respect, joy, and shared experiences. Each conversation with them reinforced the truth that I could thrive fully, without compromise, and that the love and affirmation I sought could exist outside the confines of parental expectation.
I also noticed subtle but meaningful changes in my parents' demeanor. For instance, Linda had begun sending occasional photos of small things she thought I would enjoy, her way of participating in my life without imposing judgment. Roger, too, had started sharing updates from his work and hobbies, not as instruction or criticism, but as connection. It was tentative, cautious, but it was authentic. The transformation in our relationship was not a sudden miracle. It was a gradual, deliberate process built on the foundation of truth, courage, and the undeniable reality that my independence was real and unassailable. I could see that they were learning slowly but surely to respect the person I had become, and that recognition itself was a profound gift. The apartment, once a stage for confrontation and demonstration, now felt like a sanctuary. Each item, each photograph, each detail of my life served as a reminder of the journey I had endured and the transformation I had achieved. Milo lay curled at my feet, a steady, comforting presence, and the soft hum of city life outside the window seemed to harmonize with the calm I felt inside. I realized that the final image of my story was not merely symbolic, it was lived. I had not only reclaimed my voice, but had also cultivated a life in which that voice could thrive, unencumbered by fear or expectation. It was a life rooted in authenticity, strengthened by resilience, and enriched by connection. That evening, I invited my parents for a small, informal dinner, just the three of us. There were no grand gestures, no pressure, no demands. It was simply an opportunity to share space, to converse, and to enjoy the presence of one another in a way that reflected the new equilibrium. As we sat around the table, talking about mundane things and laughing at small anecdotes, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The relationship had shifted. It was no longer dictated by unspoken rules or old hierarchies. It was guided by honesty, mutual recognition, and a willingness to respect boundaries while maintaining connection. The transformation was complete, not because it was perfect, but because it was authentic and sustainable.
Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I allowed myself a moment to reflect fully on the journey. The initial message from my parents, telling me not to come home for Christmas, had felt like rejection, a wound that cut deep. Yet it had been the catalyst for everything that followed. That single moment had forced me to confront the limitations of the life I had been living, to recognize the necessity of speaking my truth, and to claim the independence that was always mine, but had long been constrained by expectation and fear. The final image of the story, the transformation complete, was a life that reflected my choices, my values, and my voice fully realized. I turned off the lights, the apartment now quiet except for the soft rustle of the city beyond the windows. Milo stretched and settled into his bed, and I felt a sense of peace and empowerment settle over me. The story that began with rejection had ended in vindication, understanding, and personal triumph. I had faced fear, confrontation, and backlash, and I had emerged stronger, wiser, and fully present in the life I had chosen. The transformation was not a single moment, but a continuous, living process, a life defined by authenticity, courage, and the power of truth. As I drifted into sleep, I knew that this was not just the end of one journey, but the beginning of a new chapter, one where my voice, my choices, and my life would remain unshakably mine.